Hello. Hi, welcome to the session. We're very excited to have you here today. I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. And we are coming off some very exciting workshops and the panel just now, the plenary by Professor Roberts and Kathleen Creamer, and we're going to refer to that. So you're in the session about press and public relations folks and legal service offices and our work together in representing parents and in telling the stories of parents. And stories are something we've talked about for this day and a half in a couple of ways. And we're going to pick up on that in more detail in a minute. Just a little housekeeping. Our goals for the session are for attendees, for you folks to be able to get some tools and hints and ideas about working with press folks in your work as you try to shape the narrative around parents and dependency cases. Our panel today are folks who all have a different perspective or different perspectives on this, and it's going to be interesting to hear them. You should be able to see the folks' bios in the corner of the description of this, so I'm not going to read their bios to you. I'm going to summarize who they are, and I should have introduced myself. I'm Sue Jacobs. I'm the proud co-chair of the steering committee of the National Alliance for Parent Representation, working with Mimi and Marty Guggenheim to and the steering committee to shape this really fabulous set of conversations. With me on the panel today are Erica Glenn, and I can't see Erica, Ethan. I'm hoping we can see her though.
I'm trying to track her down right now, actually.
Room, okay. So we should be able to get Erica's picture back in a minute. Erica is at Los Angeles Dependency Lawyers, also known as Ladle, and she is a parent partner there. She is somebody with lived experience who's reunited with her son and works to advocate for families and parents in similar situations. Nora McCarthy is the director of Rise magazine. Nora has a journalism background. She's somebody who's worked for years with parents and helping parents learn to tell their stories. And previously with youth who she helped to tell their stories. And she's also written for Newsday, Slate, and other magazines. Eli Hager is a journalist who recently joined ProPublica, coming from 6 years, I think, at the Marshall Project. And Marshall Project majors in, as it were, stories about criminal justice. And Eli will talk a little bit about his transition from that work to covering child welfare, which he has done frequently, and this year, particularly in COVID, has written some stories on visiting in foster care in COVID, as well as stories on reporting rates, et cetera, in COVID. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Let me just frame our conversation quite briefly, and I'm going to refer back to something that Marty Guggenheim said yesterday, which is that we need to get reporters to recognize that this is a family regulatory system, not a child welfare system. And of course, Professor Roberts expanded and went further in some ways about that today and talked quite a bit about abolition and what that means. Okay, thank you, Ethan. Just a note for everyone, Erica had some internet connection issues. This is the issue with having a virtual conference and not an in-person, but I think she's coming back on. Hi, Erica.
Hi.
Yeah, sorry about your internet. Okay, so let's just frame what we're going to talk about today. You know, our field has often had what I think of as an uneasy relationship with press. Just a minute ago, I was saying that when I was the executive director of Center for Family Representation, and there was a tragedy of a death of a child in care, in foster care, or at home in New York City, a child known to a child welfare agency, sometimes I would get a call to comment on what went wrong, what's wrong with the family, what happened. And that's like a really awful way to start a conversation with a journalist. So what we want to do today is talk about how to have positive conversations, how we can work together to frame the conversation. A lot of media around this is about cycles of horrific things that happen. So it can be difficult for parents, attorneys, and parents in legal offices to work with reporters who call during these horrible times and during crises. And it's hard to then advance what you know to be a much more nuanced picture. So at the same time that has happened, you know, nationally, we're in a very transitional time, as a lot of the plenary speakers and workshop speakers have talked about, where national publications like Marshall Project, Mother Jones, The Nation, have begun to see how important the work of change is in child welfare and how it tracks the conversation nationally about race and equity and social justice. So we're going to look at why now and how now can attorneys and others involved in this work engage with the media. We want to talk about relationships with reporters, stories, and very importantly, how to prepare parents and others for talking with the press. So let me kick this off, and I do want to say it's going to be a conversation, so it bear with us because we're going to go back and forth a little bit. We will try to look at the chat when we can, and if there are questions that come up that we can't answer during this, we will be sure to get to you offline. So let me start off and ask Eli, why is it important for attorneys and others involved in child welfare or child welfare abolition to engage with the media? Can you start us off?
Well, of course, I can't claim to know what lawyers' obligations are to their clients. And, you know, I just don't know, and that's something that lawyers have to balance and figure out. But what I've pointed out to you all, and what I think is really important, is that these injustices that that have been talked about at this conference, they thrive in the dark. The child welfare system is already so shrouded in, I don't know if secrecy is the right word. There's not a lot of public knowledge about it because of the records laws, because of confidentiality laws, many of which are needed, but it's in the dark. To thrive in the dark. So I think that that's the argument to be made for talking about these things with a reporter. And I do think that, for better or for worse, the media is still how a lot of narrative change happens. As you mentioned, I've done a lot of work covering criminal justice, and we all saw how much the narrative on that issue has changed since like 2014. That was the year that Ferguson, that Michael Brown was killed. Also the year that the Marshall Project was founded. And since then, there's been such a difference in the coverage of that issue, and so much more attention paid to it. And I think that could be a model for how the narrative could change in child welfare. I think journalists lay the groundwork of information, like upon which advocacy is built. So that's my pitch.
Thank you, Eli. And I should just say, Eli's neighbor is using a chainsaw. So
I'm sorry if you can hear that.
It's okay. You might want to mute while you're not talking. That's great. Erica, I was going to ask you if you think it's important for you and others at Ladle, for instance, to engage with reporters through panels and policy.
You know, to be quite honest with you, I really think it's extremely important. Prior to working for Ladle, I had my own open DCF case for 26 months and 21 days, and now I get to advocate on this side. And I'm kind of in this pilot program where we have parent partners. And what it's done is it's created this in between, this language that, you know, we do exist. I had this experience where I got to speak for a panel, and it was the path to racial equity, valuing the Black families in the system. And in the position I am in now, 4 years later, working for Ladle as a parent advocate, and getting able to share my story from a different perspective, and just the response that I got of not realizing what it was really like on the other side. And you had mentioned, Eli, you know, that there's this culture, this history of fear. And one of the things that kind of highlights for me when I was sharing on that panel was I didn't even know that had I been given the option that I could have asked for a social worker who matched my cultural background. I wouldn't have asked for that because I didn't even know it was an option. I didn't even think to ask. And so that's kind of what we try to do now with Ladle, with having parent partners, is allowing these parents to have a voice. The reality is I have to keep saying that word allow, because they have a voice. They haven't lost a voice because they're in a situation where the system needs to step in. That's what the system is supposed to do. Ideally, that's what it was designed to do.
Thanks, Erica. That's so critical to hear, and also that you can now have a role in these forums that reporters cover and can attend. Nora, have we missed anything on why it's important?
I think storytelling is just always a really important part of advocacy, and that you can't change public practices and policies and laws without changing public opinion. And so we really know that public opinion is behind where all of us are, right? And so to close that gap, in order to have the public make sense of the kinds of legislative advocacy and the kinds of policy changes that all of us are calling for, you have to first have journalists and people who are in other, public storytelling functions like politicians be able to make sense of it. I tend to think politicians are responsive to journalism, and that journalism is responsive to the people more than the other way around. And so by beginning with journalists who are inquisitive and skeptical of the power establishment, you can start to make connections with the broader public in being skeptical of the public story that's been told about child welfare and parents.
So thank you. I wanted to move to something that folks may agree, disagree. I think there's going to be a lot of opinions about this. And that is, in telling stories, we ask people who sometimes have open cases in dependency proceedings to speak with the press. We sometimes have positions in our organizations that that's not okay, that our obligations as legal offices is to advise people not to do that and not to be the conduit for that. But we wanted to open this up a little bit and explore some of the rules in journalism and some of our thinking about whether that is whether having clients or parents speak to the press is good practice, best practice, worst practice, etc. Okay. And I want to start by asking Eli to explain the rules of engagement. When a reporter calls me when I was at CFR and said, can I speak with a client who's currently got a case in court about whatever issue they're looking at? My reflexive answer is no, no, never. Okay, because they have an open case, they're in front of a judge, I don't know what they're going to say, etc. But as we've talked about this panel, we've talked about some terms that I don't think those of us in legal organizations really fully understand. Like I would talk to a reporter and say, well, I'll talk to you off the record, not really understanding what that meant. So Eli, can you explain off the record, on background, and deep background?
Sure, and he's still chainsawing, but so just to preface this, I wouldn't necessarily, if I was talking to just an average person, I wouldn't necessarily expect them to know these things, and I would give a lot of leeway if they say off the record in a way where it's don't want me to use what they're saying, and I generally understand that. I would respect that. Whereas if the White House press me and didn't establish clearly what the terms of our conversation were, I would use whatever she said because she should know better. But so that's the preface. But in terms of what these terms mean, if you say, I'll start with on background. If you say, let's have this conversation on background, that means you can use in the article this story that I'm telling you, or this information that I'm providing you, but you're going to have some other way of describing me. And when I say me, I mean the source of the information. So in the article, it could say, according to a person, a family member, or according to a lawyer close to the case, or according to a lawyer in Massachusetts. You can have a conversation about what the descriptor would be of the source of the information. Then you have on deep background, which means you can put the information in the article, but you can't have any attribution line at all. So you can, if the journalist can otherwise corroborate the information, I can put it in my article, but I can't say that I got it from a lawyer in the case or whoever it was. I can't say any of that. So that's on deep background. And then you have off the record, which I think is the term that's most familiar to people, which is actually the most restrictive. Means literally, it's essentially telling the journalists to put down their notepad. I'm going to tell you something, but you can't use it. I mean, if you can figure out this information some other way, that's fine, but you can't use what I'm telling you. I just want you to know it. That's what off the record means. And so, yeah, that's the definitions of those three terms. And like I say, I wouldn't expect everybody to know that, but if you use those terms in conversations with reporters, you can help establish a relationship with them that's very clear about what you want shared or not shared.
And Erica, thank you, Eli. That's really helpful. And I wish I'd known that many years ago. Erica, you and I have talked about these ideas and your concern about, even on deep background, that a client or parent in your practice might be still put in a position that it's a hard conversation, and your advice might be not to have it.
I said that because, again, we're in this space where the parents already feel like they're not being heard. My concern was that it would become almost like a dumping session, and they're going to share, even though this is deep background, they might share something while they still have their case that if you follow the fairly large breadcrumbs, it'll go right back to that client. And so even with explaining, I would never encourage a parent to do that with the way that the system is set up at this time. It would be setting them up to fail.
Right. So that, and again, this is a conversation where we want everyone's thoughts, and there's no right answer. And I'm going to get to a question in the chat for a minute. I just wanted to ask Nora, in terms of these parameters, and you've done a lot of talking with parents, both with closed cases and open cases, who want to tell their stories. What's your advice been about this?
Yeah, obviously it's super complicated. It depends on who the parent is and who the journalist is, and what the topic is. You know, are you talking about legislative action, or are you talking about something super personal about like a particular case? So I don't think there's like a specific yes or no. I think at Rise, we do talk to the press all the time on background. It's really helpful to just be able to chit chat with people and talk about what you really think and say, you know, I hope you'll look into this or that, and to share resources and be in conversation. I think that, you know, really setting a parameter that I'm not about to be quoted makes it possible to have a relationship. At times we've had parents talk with a reporter that we trust, and the parent can talk on background, and then you can negotiate later. Oh, I really want to use this quote, even though we didn't agree on that. Like, is that okay? Or I'd really like to highlight this thing that this person said, and you could come back around and say, like, sure, that's not harmful. That's going to be good. We've connected some trusted journalists, especially during the pandemic, to people with open cases, because things that were happening to parents in this pandemic, I mean, there's always harmful things happening, but there was very good journalism happening at the national level about the impact of the pandemic. And we did connect parents with open cases to talk about how they did not have visits, how they did not have time with their child, they couldn't access services and all the other things. So those stories can't be told by somebody who had a prior case. So there's no way to tell that story from a compassionate perspective around families with parent voices if you don't put forward a parent with an open case. So I think it depends on the case, but it is really helpful to understand that you can talk your head off to journalists as long as you protect the conversation up front, and then you can navigate later what you're comfortable with. Not in every single case, but a lot of times you're speaking with journalists who want to showcase what's not being told, and to do that, they also have to, navigate and negotiate with care about families.
So I'm sorry, Eli.
Oh no, you first.
There was just something that we've come across in the conversation when you said, like, with care ending the Nora, and thank you for separating between, for example, if I'm speaking on a panel, or if it's coming from a personal perspective. And I think that the reality is we have this moral responsibility to these parents to make sure that we are putting them in a position where they don't understand. And so I think it's important that if your organization is going to go the route of using the media as a narrative, that they have a media consultant there, that these parents are taking a media consultation class and they understand, because if I hadn't had the experience of working in a panel, working here at Ladle, I would have known how to just, what I did share at that panel was not the full on part of my story, but it was very effective and things like that. So knowing how to put a file together and all those things are extremely important. And so having someone to navigate that with the parents. And so I just kind of wanted to add that in there, but we appreciate what you were sharing.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Eli.
No, it's a very, very quick point, but just something that I forgot to say earlier about the whole off the record thing. A lot of journalists think of that agreement, which is a point that I wanted to make, because a lot of people I'll talk to on the phone, they'll just say, like, off the record and just keep talking, and I personally would accept that, okay, this person doesn't want me to include this information, and I understand. But there are a lot of journalists who are kind of sticklers about that. Like, it's supposed to be an agreement, like you and the reporter agree, okay, this next part of what I say is on background or it's off the record. We both agree on that. So I'm just emphasizing that people should make certain that they actually are off the record, because you can't just say off the record and then say a bunch of stuff and hope the reporter like heard you.
Very helpful. So we're talking now about building relationships with reporters. We mean print, video, social media to blogging, some of those things we'll talk about in a second. But, you know, some strategies that legal services offices engage in would include developing a relationship with reporters who seem interested. There's a question in the chat about how do you even reach out to journalists to find an interested person. And certainly to reach in your, both in your locality, but also national issues related to our work. It could be so like social justice, you know, and then read that person's work to see if you like how they humanize people, or they don't, you know, you think they might be interested in your issue, and reach out to them. Also ask Nora to make some suggestions about relationship building in response to that question.
Sure, I think it's probably difficult to start a relationship cold with somebody that you don't have any connection to. But if you read somebody's work often, you can, you know, if you see that they wrote something that you like, you can just send an email and say, you know, thank you so much for covering this. If you see that you didn't like how somebody covered something, you can think about that in terms of like long-term, actually like want this person to be in my corner. So you can think like, what's part of what I want them to understand about the story that maybe they didn't understand, or like, you know, I wonder if you this, or I wonder if you knew such and such, right? To be like kind and informative, I guess, and to invite relationship. Like you could say, like, I'd love for if you could come in and, you know, talk with some of our parents or some of our staff. Like, you know, this is a really tricky issue, and, you know, I'm wondering if you'd like more information about it. And you can kind of, you know, assume that a person whose job is to inform people wants to be informed. And so I think some of that is then you can, when things happen that you think are worthy of media coverage, or like new study comes out, or there's some data happening, or there's a panel going on, you can like send that to the person and try to get them interested. It's definitely easier if you start with journalists that are already covering justice issues in some kind of way, where they just haven't applied child welfare as a lens around their work, or if you see that they are covering child welfare, but maybe have, you know, don't understand the possibilities of what they could be covering. So you can share about reunification day events, things that happen around the holidays, families reuniting, positive stuff. Even if they don't cover it, it's a chance for them to understand that there's more stories out there than maybe they were thinking about, and makes their job easier if you're letting them know that there's, you know, stuff to discover.
Thing that Eli reminded us of it when we were planning this was that reporters like documents and their editors like documents even more. So if you've done a report, if you have some data, you know, some important data just emerging from your practice, kind of evidence can also be a way into a conversation with a reporter who may be interested issue. I wanted to, excuse me, I want to relate it to this question that somebody asked in the chat, which is that would we address the tension between the parents' First Amendment right to free speech and child protective system repression of parents' ability to say anything critical of the child welfare system, including on their social accounts. So let me put that out there and see what you guys think. Anyone want to jump in?
Erica?
Eli?
Actually, Susan, would you mind just rereading that question? I don't see it in the chat on my end, and that was like, it was a pretty meaty question, so I want to make sure that I understood.
Sure. It's please address the tension between a parent's First Amendment right to free speech and the child protection system's repression of parents' ability to say anything critical of the child welfare system, even on their social media accounts. So again, go ahead, Nora.
I would just say that everybody has a First Amendment right to tell their own story, but if you have an open case, you have to really balance that around what's strategic in your case. So one experience we've had at RISE is that we do allow and invite parents to share their stories and to publish them in RISE while their cases are still open. But if we're publishing a story while a case is still open, we take some precautions, like we'll usually ask that person's attorney or some attorney to read it, and we'll ask them to review it carefully to see if everything in the story is already known to the court or not. Because you definitely don't want to be revealing in the press some history that you think of as benign that will then be used against you while your kid is fine. So I think it's very healthy for people to tell their own stories, but I think also to speak with your attorney and be really careful that you're not revealing something that can be used against you and that can harm you. And once your case is closed, go for it and do what I'm going to do as an advocate, but not, put your family at risk during that time period. What would you say, Erica?
I was just thinking like how to best, as far as social media, and I'm not saying this from a parent partner perspective, I'm saying this from a person who formerly had a case, is to like completely not allow yourself to be on social media at all. So the thing is, as I'm listening to the three of you share your different perspectives and thinking like that, I have this like obligation to my community. I'm Black and Nigerian, and the reality is, those rights are taken. They were taken from me the moment the system stepped in into my life, and so there was at no point where I would have like, oh, I have these First Amendment rights and I'm gonna do this. Like, are you kidding me? I wouldn't even, thought to think of that. I'm just trying to get through my case plan and see my child. So that's such an interesting question to ask. Let's ask that differently. Can you remind me of the rights that I'm entitled to first? That just sounds so. That's just such a funny question to ask. I think personally, I appreciate the question.
Well, I think that implicit in it is
obviously
the issue that CPS in many instances can be
reactive
in a negative way to somebody's postings. And going further, we've talked about this in
other contexts, it's possible
that a would have checked people's social media, right? Or Googled them, or to read what they're saying, either about their case or about something else. So I think is when they do that and then criticize
the parent for criticizing
their in the system, isn't the parent losing a set of rights that has already been taken away from her?
It's tricky
because you have, as Nora said, the absolute right to
use social media.
Have independency court doesn't mean, just like it doesn't mean you become less of a parent, right? you don't lose your constitutional rights, although
We all know
that
that's
that's in the breach. I think social media raises other issues
true.
which is already public, and how comfortable sometimes people have been in the past in being public on social media. And
People may not realize the implications.
of posting stuff when they think it's mostly their friends who are going to see it, right?
Right. You know, very much so. So the reason why I was pointing that out is I've had situations with clients now where I interact with their social workers and they say, you know, I saw them on Instagram or I saw them on Facebook, and this is how I was able to actually see the truth of what they were doing. And I was like, oh, is that, you know, and here I am having this conversation with my client about how we should, you know, stay off of social media and all these things. They're saying, so I don't get to just be. And there's that, again, there's that fine line. There's that dehumanizing factor. There's that, you know, you have a case, so you don't get to have any joy. You have a case, so you don't get to do this.
Right.
I think, yeah.
Anyone else have
question in the
any
chat
comment on this? About what?
Oh, we have a
Go ahead,
question in the
Nora.
chat also about what makes a compelling story get attention from the media. Eli, should we answer that question too?
Yeah.
The question
Eli,
is
why don't
about
you
what's
start off? What makes a
sorry, I didn't get the
compelling
question.
story?
Right, likely to get it.
Oh, right. So, you know, I think one of the things we talked about is that if all of you who are either have lived experience with the system or are attorneys who see these cases every single day, you might be so familiar with the things that happen that you don't even realize what is a story. And so I talk a little bit about stepping back from your expertise and trying as best you can to look at what happens in the courtroom or with your clients with completely fresh eyes, as to the extent that that's possible, and like what would be shocking to you or surprising to you or compelling to you or important to you if you were seeing this fresh and you just didn't know that these things happened. I know that's kind of a vague concept, but it's something that I would encourage. Those are the stories that will likely be shocking or surprising readers. So try to channel that. You know, I mean, more specifically, I think reporters really like. I had an editor who always said, "That's a subject, not a story," and the difference being, reporters don't want like your whole thesis on like how the whole child welfare system is dysfunctional and corrupt and racist, which it may be, but that's a subject, not a story. It's maybe a problem with journalism, but it's also just how readers consume things, that they need some kind of novelty or some kind of angle. So, but that can be anything really. It's like, you know, there could be something that's in the news that's very timely, that we call a news peg, that relates to an issue that you've been seeing forever, but it's the news peg, and it can be like, here's this one case, it ties to this larger issue, you know, that's an angle. You know, it can be something that you're seeing in your local area, and you do just a little bit of legwork to see that it's also happening in 3 or 4 other states. I also had an editor who said that three makes a pattern, which is completely arbitrary, but you know, reporters like that. If they see like, here's a trend, here's like this thing that's happening in the family court system is actually happening in places, and we can write about that. So I guess those are some tips, and I would just double down on what you said before about documents and data. I mean, it's the reporter's job to gather those things, but as much as possible, if there are documents available, or if you know your statewide data source for family court cases, if you know anything about data showing how often such and such happens, documents and data are things that are thrilling to reporters because it makes them feel more secure in publishing what they're going to publish, because there's like corroboration. I personally believe what you're telling me. I don't think that people are generally liars. I mean, some people are generally liars, but I don't think people are, like, when they're telling about their own experience, have much reason to completely make it up. But documents and data are things that reporters really want, and many child welfare reporters are very overworked. This may be one of many beats that they have. Local newspapers are really overstretched these days. They might be new to the issue. Just the more that you can provide up front, the more likely they are to do the story.
Great.
I want to get to the chat
In a second, but I wanted to ask Erica if you were talking to Eli in your office now and thinking about your practice, is there a story you would want? I'm putting you on the spot, but is there a would you want to
pitch? Something that
no one has paid attention to?
I think what I would feel most comfortable, and I think what no one has really paid attention to, and I remember, I think it was Marty yesterday when he opened up and he said a lot of really phenomenal things. And one of the things that he kept reiterating was how the child welfare system treats fathers. And so I'm starting to hear that more and more, the more panels I'm attending and things like that. And although there are no current cases that I would feel comfortable sharing, there are two fathers who are parent partners with our organization who navigated the system and whose cases are closed now, and they now work as parent partners. And so to hear their perspective and hearing now, because I was even ignorant to that before, and even now, and I'm learning now, wow, the parents, these fathers, they're not getting treated the same. They don't get the same rights as the mothers. So that's definitely I guess what was it, Eli? You said a pitch or
a pitch.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. I hadn't really thought of that, so I'll take that into consideration.
You're welcome, Eli.
Well, thanks.
And I think when you're thinking about how, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that if you're thinking about a broad issue like fathers, and there is a lot of there's data and documentation on how fathers are kind of pushed out and kept out of the child welfare process because from the system's perspective, they often just complicate it, right? That if you're thinking of a broad story like that, you can first think about like the experiences of fathers who have their cases closed and what they might say, and then also be looking for like a very current case and where there might be like a thing that happened. So if a father who had a really typically rough time of getting his kids home finally, reunites, then that's a way to anchor the story to, something that's happening right now with only a marginally open case and some other fathers who could speak to the issue and some, work that's been done by Vivek and others, so you can kind of like put the story together in your mind, in your community, and you can kind of wait until you have something that seems to make it topical or timely for a reporter. And I don't think you want to over-report the entire story and be like, here's the entire story for a journalist, but then you can just write like a simple note like, I wondered if you'd be interested in the story of a father who's getting his kids back on Tuesday. It was such a hard fight. Fathers are so often marginalized in child welfare. This is a really good dad who could speak to this, like whatever. So you can try to take an issue and make it a story by kind of planning ahead if that's something that you commonly see that you want the media to lift up. That's something that we do at Rise, is look at what is a typical type of injustice and how do you match a more current story or moment, or you can grab a moment to make something that you've been knowing about for years come to feel timely.
I just wanted to follow up on that. It's a real balancing act with how much to provide the reporter. Reporters they want a lot of help because they're overworked, as I said before, and they want documentation because they're skeptical by nature. But I think reporters are also kind of insecure about, like, they want to be the ones that did the story, and also because they're skeptical by nature. If you come to them with something that feels totally prepackaged, like almost like a PR pitch, where it's like, here's this like perfect story, and here's this other piece, and here's this other piece, and here's how, like, I think the reporter would want to do a little bit more of their own work, and also would feel a little skeptical of that, like they're just doing a PR piece instead of, journalism. So I know that's conflicting a little bit with what I said before about providing data and documents if you have it, but I think there's a line to walk there where you can be really helpful. You can kind of be a guide to the reporter and show them where the data is that is to be found. Provide what documents you may have on the case or are able to share on the case, but not be kind of this presence kind of containing and controlling the story, because reporters will have a reflexive reaction to that.
So I wanted to, reflecting on what you said in the chat, talk about
two different
kinds. So we've been talking story generic, but there is the story that is a policy piece, in a sense, wrapped around a family. And so somebody says, we're working hard to create a narrative around poverty as it pertains to neglect allegations in particular. Have you taken that approach? And if so, how has it worked? Before we get to that, I want to contrast with the next comment, which is the press moves quickly. What's a good strategy for talking points when a crisis occurs? Which is what happened, this happens to be in Colorado, when a judge was, I think it was a hot mic situation, was caught out making some unbelievably racist statements. And then the CNN covered it, other press covered not only her statements at that time, but now there's a concern about things in general, perhaps other racist judges who will. So we've got crisis quickly, and we've got a narrative that may be a longer term story. Any pointers about those? They're obviously different. Yeah. Nora, you want to jump in?
Those are like wildly different questions. So I'm trying to think about that. I think in a crisis, the press does move quickly and you just need to respond immediately. So I think it's a matter that, did you already build a relationship with reporters who might reach out to you to add, nuance to a situation or story? And do you have relationships with parents and youth who could speak to that issue that you are able to call up and call upon? So, at Rise, we're lucky because we have a lot of parents on our staff, right? The staff is 15 impacted parents. And so you can always connect a reporter to a parent who could speak to a timely issue. But if you don't have that, then, kind of working on having ambassadors beyond your own, attorney staff. I think that's an important thing, to be ready to connect people who can really be great spokespeople for an issue and have a different kind of credibility than you during a crisis. I think in terms of like a longer term narrative shift, with something like, trying to help people understand like poverty is a driver of child welfare. Child welfare isn't exactly what you're thinking of. We had some breakthrough stories in New York that, moved the needle on that. There was the Jane Crow story that was really about, parents like losing custody of their children because the child wandered out of their house when the parent was taking a bath, and other like everyday things that people could very much relate to. So I do know that the reporter knew an attorney, and the attorney was able to tell her some stories like, this is a real case. This is like actually happened. And so that kind of big story, like poverty or racism just causing removals, was able to be pinned to some very specific people who could tell that story. I think that's what's really critical is if you have that bigger field and you want to advance something and help people understand that, you have to find example stories, because otherwise something that's unbelievable to a lot of people can become believable when it becomes, documented by real people and real documents. And a reporter can make something that to be real seem real to the public. So that's the space we're in with child welfare. What is true has to be made to seem true. And so you can do that by finding examples of that reality and of how broad that reality really is.
To quickly add on the crisis or breaking news type situation, that again, I'm just trying to channel like what reporters generally are wanting or are nervous about, but this is another thing that I think is a little bit silly about journalism, but it's very true, so it's worth knowing, which is that reporters really don't want to do the exact same story that another outlet has already done, even though it might be useful to have stories in multiple outlets saying the same thing. Not everybody's going to read the first story, but I guess I'm saying if there is a breaking news situation and you see what the coverage of it has been so far, and you're identifying some other aspect of it that hasn't been covered, reporters will really latch on to that. The kind of the novelty of that, or the having a fresh angle. I'm just saying it would be appealing if you're pitching to a reporter not to just I guess I'm making a case to know what the coverage has already been and not to pitch the same story that has already been written.
So this goes to, go Erica, go ahead.
Sorry, Susan. So Eli, I just had a question for you. So like, what would be your thoughts on this perspective of linking onto the poverty question and earlier talking about this narrative of fathers, and what if we were to kind of, during a case, there's many things that a parent needs to have happen that they have to pay for out of pocket, right? And having a case plan that would be fully funded. So how could that be something that could link on to a larger story of where poverty is kind of always out there? Well, here we are, and we have this parent who needs, funding for their case plan. Would that be something that the media would find interesting?
Absolutely. Sorry about this. I mean, I think poverty and the fact that the of cases in the child welfare system being neglect, not abuse, and that neglect often stems from poverty, I think that pretty much is the defining story of child welfare. I mean, I don't know if maybe you all have other things, but I think that is the most important subject there is for us to cover as journalists. The trick is, again, getting it from a subject to a story. That is obviously a very big overarching concept, And so the trick is finding what are and when I say a story, it could be any number of things. It could be, here's a unique data set that shows exactly how this is a problem, or here's a story about a parent or parents in poverty who are having a particular sheds light on that larger issue. Or here's this law that's being considered, or this case that's being a court that could provide that peg that I was talking about before for looking at this larger issue of how it's really about poverty and so on. So I don't know if I'm answering your question well, Erica, but I basically think that yes, absolutely. It's what I'm trying to cover that in almost all of the stories that I write, but I need some kind of more specific thing so that it's not like an academic paper, I guess.
Right. No, and like I think you definitely answered it. And I was thinking, if I was just viewing this and I wasn't like on the panel, like how would I better understand? Like even one of the questions in the chat is like, it's like it says racial disparity to one group, government outreach to another, pitching in these different aspects. And it's like you were saying, so it's not this big thesis, but it's something that's always the umbrella. There's this umbrella of poverty. Well, how do we use this umbrella to our advantage? And so you definitely were able to shine light on that question.
So
I could just add that.
Good enough.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to add that. In addition, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
There's a delay. I'm so sorry. There's a delay. Let me just throw out there to you, Nora, that are solutions that we all, there's situations that we all know about that we forget that folks that I used to call civilians, including reporters, don't know about. So Erica might every day be seeing some progress or solution or change in a situation, impact that she's doing and parents are doing together, that we just do in our regular course of business. But if we step back, it may be a surprise to Eli, or it may be a surprise to others that we're trying to pitch to. So I think that's one thing. The other point I was going to make is we all are busy in our daily lives, as are the media. One thing that could be useful as you think about this in the field and go back after these 2 days of heavy conversations is how can we as law organizations and advocacy groups be more systematic about these stories and thinking about them. And there have been a few suggestions that people have made recently and also historically. One is to have folks who are the point people in your practitioner, you're the point person, right? Office, though, with a few people who are interested in media coverage or who have gotten, might want to have a media team. And I'm not talking about PR professionals necessarily, although some people may go that route. But Erica, you and 3 of your colleagues might, Dennis, maybe on the chat saying, what are you talking about? But you might want to constitute, right, a committee or a team in the office who are the people who look at coverage, right? Not everyone. So you look at coverage coming in about your issues, you think about typical stories that might help to illustrate some of that, you create like talking points that you have in-house. So I just wanted to make that sort of best practice suggestion. Sorry, Nora, I cut you off.
No, I was going to say something similar, and I appreciate that. I think it's really hard to do media work when you actually have to, go to court and represent your clients, or like you're sitting with a parent, or you're doing your work. And so making a priority of that and saying like, we're actually going to, read Child Welfare in the News, make this a decision of like how we're going to spend some of our time, read Twitter, things like that are really important. I was going to say that, the only tools that you have aren't just talking with reporters when they call or building relationships, but also using media to amplify your story yourself by writing letters to the editor or writing op-eds, and that's a good way to get some of those broader issues out there. So if you're wanting to share that poverty is the driver of child welfare involvement in your community, you don't think that's well understood, you can write that yourself and seek to place the op-ed. And you can also follow up on coverage that you think is missing the beat by writing op-eds, and you can coordinate that with other allies. Because if a newspaper gets multiple letters to the editor on the same article, it's more likely to publish one of them, right? And so something that I think Richard Wexler's been really effective at with all of us in New York is he rallies the team. He'll be like, all right, this came out, who's writing an op-ed, who's writing a letter to the editor, get on it, and people will all rally together. Or you can not let it go by that there's stuff happening that you're concerned about. And I think that was really important, especially in 2017 when we had a crisis where a child was killed, and it was a horrific case, and the kind of case that often derails progress toward real safety for families. Even the New York Times really covered it in a quite problematic way, and including their editorial board. And I think the entire child welfare community really came together to write letters and to speak to the reporters and say, we're worried, because did you know that media coverage of this sort often propels, and still did propel, thousands of needless cases? I would really activate your networks and be planful together about who's going to do what, so that things don't go past you without a response, and be able to move your perspective forward in relation to media, because media is an event just like a real event.
That's
not that it's not a real event, but it is an event around which you can rally.
Good point. So we have just a little less than 10 minutes or so. I wanted to move us to the last question or topic we wanted to talk about, which bounces off what Nora just said, which is responding to bad coverage and to good coverage. One thing it took me a long time to learn was that the media are not just out there frozen archetypes. They're people like Eli, and they like feedback. And I thought, it took me a while to understand that if I read a story, say in the time Nora was talking about in 2017, that I thought was inaccurate or, put parents, generally painted parents with a broad brush in a bad light, let's just say. I might call that reporter or email that reporter, not to be quoted in a story, but just to say, hey, I'd like to give you some feedback about what you said, how you said it, and what I believe the reality to be based on our experience. So you can do that with individual reporters. You can write letters to the editor. Lots of times, as Nora knows, we've engaged in writing op-eds, or to the New York Times, no longer called op-eds, but essays to reframe the issue that a story might have, in our view, gotten wrong. And I don't know how much those are listened to, but they can be impactful. As I said, you could write to the editor directly, asking for a call if you can't reach out to the reporter or the reporter's not responding to you. And that's both in stories or coverage you like and stories and coverage that you don't like. But engage, I guess, is my point in terms of practice. Others want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I I don't have much to say beyond that I agree that's a good thing to do. I definitely like getting feedback. I'm going to squeeze in a point that I wanted to make that's not sure.
I was going to give you.
I mean, it's kind of related. I guess as you're responding to reporters or working with reporters in general, I just think it's important that to obviously everyone here knows that these cases are complicated. So I don't need to tell you all that, but just as the media in those types of bad stories can make things black and white, like this evil parent and terrible thing happened, and just very sensationalist and black and white kind of coverage. I think that sometimes there's a little bit of a tendency, not to call anybody out, but a little bit of a tendency to, in response to that, to try to paint your client, or if you if you're advocating for somebody who's a parent, as just kind of like a hero or a martyr or an angel, is a completely uncomplex figure, which nobody is. And first of all, so nobody is, so that's not the truth. And also, second of all, journalists will kind of have a bad reaction to that. They'll think of you more as just a pure advocate rather than an expert, and you want to be seen as an expert. I think, as a rule, when you're talking to a journalist, you want to be seen as an expert, not an advocate. Even though not that being an advocate is a bad thing. I'm just talking about what they'll trust. And so I think, acknowledging mistakes that a client has made is a good thing, and will make the coverage more fairer. And I think that if I think readers, when there's only just kind of like this general sense of a person that they've been victimized or that they're a martyr, they actually kind of assume the worst about what the parent did. I think if you're just kind of more upfront and honest about what the case involves and how it connects to their life circumstances and how the systemic barriers that they're facing played a role in their case, and like you just give all the context, the reporter will trust you more. It will make a better. The readers won't assume the worst. I just think, in talking to parent advocates and attorneys, I worry sometimes that there's an oversimplification of cases that they can do as well. The media has traditionally done it in the other way, but it can happen both ways, and I kind of wanted to make that point.
So I just want to, in the few minutes we have left, ask final questions based on our conversations. Erica, we talked about what would have helped you be prepared for press inquiries or for being on panels and sharing or oversharing. Is there anything you want to sort of suggest to folks about that?
Well, that's a really good question. I think I'm really lucky to be at the organization that I'm at, that I have a lot of different mentors that I can go to that really helped me in forming my story in a way that would be effective for the parents that I am now representing in the stage that I am in and representing my community. I'm fortunate enough to have that. And so that's definitely key. There's like this question in the chat where it's just like, should we write our own press releases? So I just didn't want to lose sight of that question. But also, additionally, when I prepared for any panel, the panels themselves, we meet several times in panels that I've done. And so I kind of have always had like an open door policy with my mentors to be able to ask them questions. And I'm a big question asker. I really, really am. But I do like to do my due diligence and my research and to make sure that I am sharing exactly that depth and weight, Eli, that you were mentioning. So it's not this flatline story. So that's not getting lost, because sometimes when people hear like it's shocking, and then you see me and you hear the story, and like, no, this is reality. It is me, and and I am a real person.
Thank you. That's helpful, and helpful for all of us to keep in mind as we think about who is telling their story and what tools would be useful. Eli, I wanted to ask about a recent story you did on foster care, visiting in foster care during COVID. That was heartbreaking. Many of us probably had read it in the Marshall Project, but I was wondering how you got into that story. What was it that made you want to write that?
I mean, because it was happening to a lot of people, and it was a important story that was, yeah. I mean, sorry that I was being flip with that answer, but you know, COVID was the story of this past year, and I, by that time, was the only person covering child welfare and family court issues for the Marshall Project, and
Thanks.
it was a critical and heartbreaking thing that was happening to so many parents last year. So I saw it as my responsibility to cover that issue. You know, and it had such, I mean, it's just such a human thing. So many people are parents themselves. Everybody's had parents themselves, and the idea of having to interact with your baby or young child over a video screen, I mean, it's something that would connect with a lot of readers, no matter their usual orientation toward the family court system. They might think that all the parents who have child welfare cases are bad people, but just, which is a terrible opinion, but still just like not being able to interact with your child in person, I think it's just so incredibly relatable. And so if you can find those things that are relatable to people, it's good.
Thank you, and thank you for including the videos of parents trying to talk to their baby on their iPad. It was heartbreaking, even for those of us who have seen this for years. It was really wrenching and important. Nora, any last points for folks in terms of your messages from RISE and your experience in working with parents to learn to tell their stories?
No, I would just say that, like, when you're seeking media coverage and you're talking with a reporter, you're making yourself vulnerable because the other person has the power to tell the story, and your only role is to be able to try to communicate your perspective and what you can. And we all really care about the issues and the families that we're working with. And I just want to say that it hasn't been that neat. Like, I've been on the phone with a reporter and like cried and been like, why are you telling this story? And like had somebody hang up on me, but like, you know, like, I called him back, but you know, I really, I've objected to things. I've been heartbroken. I haven't liked where stories have gone. I've like, you know, I feel very passionate. I like love the people that I'm working with, and I want them, like, against Eli's advice, I like want them to be seen like in their full beauty. But honestly, that does mean in their full complexity, right? So I think you have to recognize that you're taking risks, and that the risks that you're taking can have benefits that won't be possible without that risk taking. And so to try to build trust and build relationships with reporters so that, you know, you get each other, and you're advancing a narrative, a complex narrative together, I think is a really, really important thing for attorneys to be able to do, you know, stories. And so if you get good, you're good at telling them in court when you have the chance, right? But like, you can tell stories that have a transformative power, and you're almost the only ones in that position.
Thank you all. We are out of time. Thank you all of the panelists, Nora, Eli, Erica, you're awesome. It's been wonderful to work with you. And for all of you guys in cyberspace, Thank you, thank you. Thanks for your comments and your thoughts. And this was recorded and the chat will be available. Ethan, thanks for your support too.
Thank you.
Bye
It was
all.
great to meet you guys.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.